The combined might of Russian and Chinese Air Force swoops down on Japan and limited US presence that is there. Thousands of missiles paralyze the forces on Japanese islands, and US island bases such as Guam are faced with the incoming enemy naval fleets. But the US military is vast, its navy is huge, with far more carriers. Could the US hold onto its Pacific bases against such an enemy? And what would the US retaliation look like? First, a word from our sponsor. War Planet Online is a free-to-play real-time strategy game where you place your base on a detailed real-world map. Here's my base where I'm currently working on expanding my army. I'm located right next to Washington. The level of detail is really fascinating. Here are the capitals of the countries we'll be discussing in this video. If your faction is strong enough, you can capture all of them. You can engage in epic real-time battles against other human players, move the borders, claim the region, or even conquer the whole world. The game lets you choose commanders and craft powerful items. You pick your strategy, build up your base, gather resources, forge alliances, and conquer lands. The units in-game are inspired by real-life weapon systems, armored, assault, and aerial units, all of which can be upgraded. Click on the link below to try out War Planet Online. We have also prepared a special surprise, so watch out for the Binkov puppet in-game. Let's go on with our Great Pacific Brawl. Mind you, this is a hypothetical war analysis. To keep it simple, there is no prep time, no nukes, no allies. Every other country is fully neutral. What does that mean for US forces currently in South Korea? Well, they're to relocate to Japan. In doing so, they would raise the US forces in Japan by quite a margin, both in army and air force numbers. Being in alliance, Japan would quickly be giving the US access to any bases it might need, including setting up new ones, using existing commercial airports, etc. Japan itself doesn't have a terribly large air force, but it would have to do, at least until US gets to send reinforcements. The US would not be the only one without a full military presence at the start of the war. Russian military is mostly positioned to fight the war in Europe, so most of its air forces would need to relocate to the east first. Only a part of its naval fleet is in the Pacific. Indeed, the Baltic and Black Sea fleets are unlikely to even participate. They have a lot of non-ocean going ships, and even the bigger ships would be unlikely to survive the trip. The US Navy, much more suited to ocean operations, would likely intercept them. Neither Baltic nor Black Sea fleet are particularly potent on their own. Their northern fleet would come in handy though, but it might need time to get to Bering Strait, depending on the time of the year. Of course, actually going through the strait in face of US forces would be another issue. China too is large enough so that it would need to shuffle its air forces at least a little bit, so most of them are in the position to attack Japan. Initial Chinese and Russian air forces close to Japan would still be a few times bigger than US and Japanese ones. But the composition of those forces is an area where China and Russia fall behind, as they don't have as many advanced fighters. The US has more stealthy planes, and more planes equipped with modern phased array radars. Once all those do come in, the red side would better be already in possession of some of the Japanese islands, if they're to succeed in throwing out the US out of Japan. The US has more long-range bombers, though the Russian Tupolev-22M and Chinese H-6 fleet sort of make up for that, as most of Japan is fairly close within the bomber range. Specialized ground attack plane numbers are slowly dwindling on both sides, though the US does have more A-10s. All the figures so far did not include some of the specialized strike planes the Russians and Chinese use, but that mostly means those are old planes, unable to do multiple roles. Further issue for the red side is that they would have fewer precision strike bombs, and other assets such as targeting pods. Their air forces are more geared towards air combat and aren't as focused on providing ground strikes. Another issue would be distance. Most of the air bases on mainland Japan would be out of range for most of Red Side's planes. The Reds have only a limited number of aerial tanker planes. Pilot training hours is an area where Russia is behind, though the Chinese are getting close to the US Air Force hours due to Pentagon financial cutbacks of the last decade. Luckily for Russia and China, they do have a large number of various ballistic and cruise missiles. which might be brought within hours or days to launch positions, possibly a week for some of the farther away Russian Iskander units. Russian missiles could have the Hokkaido island in range. Exact range of Iskander is not known. While the export variant is limited at 300 kilometers, the Russian variant might be, due to the INF treaty, limited to 500 kilometers. Chinese missiles are more plentiful, but due to the distance to Japan, would have a harder time reaching some targets. Most of their missiles might not reach Tokyo proper, for example. Moving some to Russian territory near the sea might help, though. Given how the cruise missiles have a range of well over 1,000 miles, another 2,000 missiles might reach anywhere in Japan. Targets such as Guam and even Wake Island could be in reach of air-launched cruise missiles, but in reality, most of those missiles would be more effectively used on targets in Japan proper. Missile strikes are a game both sides can play. While Japan is mostly devoid of such offensive weapons, the US does have quite a few already in the vicinity, with the US Air Force probably getting more and more as the first week progresses. The US Navy does have a lot of Tomahawk missiles, but actually getting US ships to Japan would take a while. Some ships would not even be available due to maintenance. That does apply for all three sides. The Pacific is huge. Bringing the US East Coast fleet could take up to a month. Getting from San Diego to East China Sea would take a week and a half, once the fleet is ready to sail out, which for part of the fleet, especially big-ticket items like some carriers, would not even apply. Looking at US carrier deployments, it would be plausible that 3 carriers would be somewhat close to Western Pacific. 3 more would be in their bases, ready to sail out within a week or 2. But 4 more carriers would simply be unavailable, as they're undergoing complex refueling and overhaul that can take a few years. 1 more carrier is brand new and might take some months to be rushed into a combat mission. Out of those 5, 2 could perhaps join the active Navy by the summer of 2020, speeding up their return to active status due to the war. By 2021, more could join the Navy. Similar issues beset other ships for all navies. The larger the ship is, the longer their maintenance. Though the nuclear refueling is the worst culprit there, so the US carriers are especially hit. Chinese Navy is somewhat less influenced, as it doesn't have as many large ships and most of its ships are new, so most of them haven't required complex overhauls. The Russian Navy, however, does have quite a few ships undergoing such overhauls, including its sole aircraft carrier, which would not be available anytime soon. Near their shores, the Red Side's Navy does outnumber the initially present Blue Side Navy, and in theory they could try and support some invasions on some of the Japanese islands. Just to note, while China does have 2 carriers, it has only 24 planes between them, and 1 carrier is brand new, needing some months to get into proper action. But it's likely the 2 Russian fleets would never get to meet. The Bering Strait is far away from most of the Russian air bases, and without much Russian air cover, the US Navy and Air Force presence around the strait would be too much for the Russians. Still, they would tie up a sizable portion of the US Navy, making the Blue Side unable to go after Chinese Navy in full force. The Chinese fleet would be too far away to join the Russian fleets, as it would first have to fight its way through the first and second island chains. Or even worse, try to fight their way through Tsushima Strait. That choke point is so narrow that it's unlikely the Chinese fleet could survive crossing it, with all the US assets being flown in. Japan already possesses a sizable fleet of aircraft that could attack ships and submarines in such a tight strait. The US has a few dozen aircraft in place and could probably fly in dozens more before China manages to assemble its fleet. Actually, when it comes to special mission planes, the US and Japan are likely to keep their edge throughout the whole war. There are just so many of those at disposal. Russia and especially China are still behind in that regard. That extends to aerial early warning planes as well, though it would take more time for the US to send in planes and then match and overcome the initial numbers of AWACS aircraft Russia and especially China could field. The Japanese Navy would also come into play right away before the US reinforcements arrive, and it's quite large, with an accent on anti-submarine warfare, while lacking a bit in anti-air defenses for its size. But at the start, the Chinese and Russian Pacific fleets would outnumber the Japanese and Americans, especially in submarines, though US subs are on average newer and more capable. Still, Most of Red Side's subs are advanced enough to pose a serious threat. Ships-wise, assuming a few US carrier groups are close by, the difference would be smaller. While the Russian fleet is quite old, the Chinese one is for the most part new and should be capable. But even those figures, where the blue side is behind, would not mean the red side could simply sail east of Japan, combine their fleets and cut Japan off. The air power present would confine both the Chinese and the Russian fleet to their areas. Indeed, for the Reds to proceed into the ocean, the first island chain would need to be taken from the blue side. Ryukyu Islands in particular would be one of the most important battlefields. There are many islands there. The more there are, the harder it is for blues to hold onto them, as the attacking Chinese could pick and choose which islands to attack in which order, while the blue side would have to defend every one. Certainly though, the ones closer to China would be easier to take, while ones close to Japanese mainland would be very hard to take. Also, most islands don't have military presence, so for some there would be a race deciding who can disembark forces on them first. Due to the overwhelming presence of Chinese forces near their coastline and feeble blue numbers at the start of the war, it's likely the southernmost islands would be occupied fairly quickly by China. China does possess sizable assault forces. Its amphibious assault forces alone number 30,000 personnel. Coupled with paratroopers and helicopter air assault, that figure could be doubled. But a third of that number would not be maneuver unit combat troops. US currently has one Marine division in Japan. Japan itself has one small amphibious assault and airborne assault brigade. Of course, more would be on the way, but for the US Marines, it would take weeks or a month to fully assemble. And actual ships with which the US Marines could react and go retake islands present in Japan are enough for just a few thousand troops. Again, weeks would be needed for more ships. Chinese transport fleet would be much closer, and it's pretty big. Since the islands are fairly close, even some of the bigger landing craft or hovercraft could be used for the closest islands, and then again for island hopping to the next island. The Chinese Navy would very likely be able to provide support for those landings, and fend off any early blue side's counterattacks before the US manages to come in fully reinforced. The Okinawa base would too likely fall. The fact there's thousands of Marines there would be both a curse and a blessing. More troops means it would be harder to take, but so many troops on a not so large island means Chinese constant bombardment would decimate them before the landing does occur. The Russians up north would have a harder time. Their position is quite close to Japan. Japanese Hokkaido Island is in range of artillery from the Russian Kuril Islands. Russians currently have two garrisons nearby, numbering a few thousand troops. But Russians would have a harder time exploiting that proximity. The few transport ships they do have nearby would likely be better used to beef up those Kuril Island defenses, rather than attempt any attack on Hokkaido proper. Small islands of Rebun and Rishiri may get invaded though. The Northern Fleet ships would, as explained earlier, likely not be able to join the fleet. Even if they did, they would need a week or two to break through the northern ice route. The ace card the Russian side would play is their airborne assault force. It's the largest in the world. While most of it would still need a week or two to assemble and get to the Pacific front, it would be a threat to the Japanese troops, tying them down throughout their mainland, as the blue side wouldn't know where they might try to land. Both Russian and Chinese airborne units use armored infantry fighting vehicles, giving them heavier platforms than what the blue side could muster in their airborne assault. Of course, actually trying to perform airborne assault where there is no air superiority would be hugely damaging to those Russian forces. Even if part of the airborne troops do survive, they would be hard-pressed from all sides and would probably be lacking supplies within a matter of days. There might be a better use of those airborne troops, aside for counterattacks if the US Marines try, after some weeks, to take some of the Kuril Islands. Russian airborne troops might help the Chinese effort. Assaulting Okinawa would certainly help the Reds' cause. Perhaps even some of the other middle Ryukyu Islands could also be taken quickly. Chinese vast rocket artillery force, with their guided missiles as well as their sizable helicopter force, would make subsequent attacks on nearby islands easier. Russian assets could aid them as well. Another option, or even addition to those ops, would be assaults on Goto Islands and Tsushima Island. with the Chinese Navy support preventing the Blue Forces' counterstrike and both Russian and Chinese air forces converging on those islands. Of course, the great proximity of those islands to the mainland Japan would mean those islands would more and more get attacked by the US forces, once the US Navy and Air Forces start coming to Japan in massive numbers. The mainland Japan would mostly be safe from invasions. Japanese air defenses are quite varied. Some US SAM units would already be present at the start, and more would be coming in each day via the US airlift effort. Both Japanese and US Patriot batteries feature anti-ballistic missile defenses, and both of their navies have ships with similar defenses. While most of the Red Side's missiles would likely go through per attack, the overall effect of that rain of missiles would still be limited. There would be tens of thousands of tactical targets over Japan, not even counting the vehicle-sized army units. An order of magnitude less missiles going after them, and the fixed targets such as runways and depots would be repairable in time. So the Red Missile Force would be a weapon of temporary effect, not something that would be much of a factor past the initial few weeks. The Japanese ground army is big enough to deal with any sort of landing force which would have to be equipped with comparatively lighter weapons. The US Army additions would likely not even be that urgent. The US airlift and sealift capacity, reinforcing Japan, would initially during the first month be focused on additional air defenses and rapid reaction forces such as airborne assault units, in addition to more Navy ships and more Air Force planes. The US Air Force reinforcements would also take up quite a bit of the airlift capacity, as each additional squadron of combat planes needs hundreds of personnel to support it and hundreds of tons of supplies. For the most part, US planes relocating to Japan would need support of aerial tankers, due to the vast distances involved. Luckily for the US, a vast tanker fleet is available, and it would work overtime to service both the incoming combat and transport planes. Progress of invasion would be of utmost importance for the Reds, as once the US forces do relocate to Japan, the numbers would not be in Red's favor. Not only that, but the US ships are on average bigger and more capable, especially the carriers. The list shown doesn't include carriers unlikely to be available before summer of 2020 due to overhauls. Again, one Chinese carrier would be without planes, unless the Russian carrier-borne units somehow managed to do a crash course integration on it, which would still take at least weeks. US submarines are all nuclear and pretty advanced, while a lot of Red Side's nuke subs stem from Cold War technology. And most of the Red Side subs are non-nuclear subs anyway, more suitable to holding an area rather than going on attack. US expeditionary units alone are considerable and would eventually start taking back the northernmost Ryukyu Islands, though by then we're talking about 6 months into the war. The Chinese would likely get a chance to sail out of the first island chain before that with their navy, but what would be the point? Going north to mainland Japan would only mean going into the concentration of enemy air and naval power. And as the Chinese Navy gets some 500 miles away from the mainland shores, it would lose the added protection of the Chinese air power. Even assuming China manages to operate many planes from the newly taken Ryukyu Islands, which would be questionable due to ever-growing US Air Force raids from Japan, there would still be some 900 miles left to get to Guam, for example. Assembling a big Chinese naval force to go towards Guam would be possible in theory, but it would likely be faced with several carriers and dozens to 100 of Guam-based planes, depending on how effectively the Chinese missile attacks could close those Guam airstrips. The Chinese submarine force would also be low in numbers, with Chinese conventional subs unsuited to the fast maneuvering warfare in the open ocean. So the Chinese would likely be outright defeated if they venture out to Guam. The US could afford to lose dozens of destroyers and a few carriers in a decisive battle, neutralizing most of the Chinese Navy, if needed. The US wouldn't have it easy, of course, as their main weapon is still the old Harpoon anti-ship missile. The Chinese have increased their numbers of supersonic anti-ship missiles on ships and aircraft, though they may not get in range to make full use of them. Moving so far away from the Chinese coast would also mean no long-range anti-ship ballistic missiles for the Chinese. Would those missiles even be so deadly? Hard to say. Evidently, the ever more expanding anti-ballistic missile protection on US ships does suggest they're a valid threat. And over the last decade, the Chinese have expanded their aerial and space-based tracking assets. Today, their satellite fleet is far more potent than the Soviet Union's ever was for tracking of naval targets. But again, the closer to Chinese coastline the area of interest is, the less area there is to cover overall, making the job of tracking carrier groups 600 miles from China considerably easier compared to tracking them 2,000 miles away around Guam. Going after satellites opens up a whole new front though, which may not be in the US interest. Losing satellite navigation, for example, makes precision attacks very hard, which is something US would need if they're to take back the Japanese islands. If the US tries to go for the Chinese mainland coast, it would not only run into more Chinese coastal ships, but also into considerable Chinese air defense systems. Going after Russia would be somewhat easier. The area up north is bigger, and the concentration of military bases is far smaller on the Russian Pacific coast. While going after mainland proper would be probably out of the question due to the combined Russian and Chinese ground forces, the distances between important areas are so big that the Reds would be hard-pressed to defend everything. Sakhalin Island is crucial for Russia. It would likely tie a lot of Russian defenses to it. But so are the Kuril Islands and Kamchatka. Not all three could be defended after months and months of US counterstrikes. The Kuril Islands in particular would be vulnerable once the Russians lose the control over the seas nearby. Launching attacks from Hokkaido would likely see the US taking most, if not all, of the Kurils by the end of the year 1 of the war. Chinese Air Force might help, but most of it would be tied defending the Ryukyu Islands. Down south, the Chinese bases in the South China Sea would be another area where US could go to, but it's possible those wouldn't be worth it. Those Chinese island bases are too far away from US bases. Projecting power that far onto enemy islands, which are pretty close to China itself, would be quite ineffective and would require too large of a force and too many casualties. More important for the US would be taking those Ryukyu Islands first, which again, due to the proximity of some of them to China, may not be possible within a year. A longer war past the 1-year date would change the battlefield even more, but we're talking about mobilization of the whole industry and populations of entire countries by then, not just about initial military forces. All that is outside the scope of this video. Suffices to say that even within the first year, the Red side's gains would be mostly temporary. Losses-wise, both sides would likely lose upward of 1,000 planes, and probably over 100 naval vessels each. Though as percentage of total forces, such losses would hit the Red side a bit harder. And Red side would lose some more ground troops while taking all the islands, in costly assaults. The Blue side retaking those islands would benefit from being able to wait out the enemy, once they're cut off from supplies. Given how the front line would mostly go back to where it was for China, and how Russia might even lose important islands, overall the US and Japanese side would come out of it all in somewhat better shape. Once again, thank you to Gameloft's War Planet Online for sponsoring this video. Check out their link below. And remember, Binkov may talk about hypothetical wars, but only real peace can bring us all together.